Welcome to our deep dive, into this tricky world of talking to strangers.
Ooh, talking to strangers.
We're using Malcolm Gladwell's book,
Okay.
Talking to Strangers, as our guide today.
Okay.
And it's packed with stories and insights about how we interpret behavior, whether we're any good at spotting deception,
Right.
and just generally navigating those awkward,
Yeah.
uncertain moments that come with interacting with people we don't know well.
It can be so awkward.
It really can.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head there.
Thanks.
Gladwell he has this way of weaving together psychology,
Yeah.
sociology, history, even true crime,
Uh-huh.
to show us just where communication can totally break down.
Yeah, and what's really cool is he uses real-world examples,
Mm.
like things that actually happen to him,
Yeah.
or things we've probably all heard about in the news or something,
Yeah.
to make these ideas stick.
Yeah, like that makes it relatable.
Yeah.
You know?
Totally.
One of the first things he dives into is this concept of defaulting to truth. Oh.
And it turns out we're practically hardwired to believe what people tell us.
That's wild.
I know.
But I guess it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, if we were constantly second-guessing every single person that we met,
Right.
society would fall apart.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, psychologist Tim Levine calls this truth default theory.
Okay.
It's what makes social interactions smooth.
Okay.
But, as Gladwell points out,
Yeah.
it also leaves us wide open to being tricked.
Yeah. Like, remember Bernie Madoff?
Oh, yeah.
That whole Ponzi scheme.
Ugh.
Investors, even the super savvy ones,
Right.
just kept trusting him because of his reputation.
They defaulted to believing in his success.
Yeah.
Even when there were red flags waving right in front of them.
It's almost like our brains prefer to believe a good story,
Yeah.
even if it means ignoring inconsistencies or
But-
red flags or whatever.
Just like we want to believe.
We want to.
Yeah.
And there's this other crazy example Gladwell uses. Anna Montes.
She was a Cuban spy
What?
who worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency,
Wow.
the DIA,
Okay.
for years.
Wow.
She was considered a top Cuba analyst. Totally trusted.
So she was like deep undercover.
Deep undercover.
Wow.
Her colleagues,
Yeah.
all experts in their fields,
Right.
they defaulted to believing her too.
Of course.
Right.
They had no reason not to.
I guess so.
It just goes to show that even when there's evidence that contradicts what someone is saying,
Uh-huh.
we often struggle to override that initial gut feeling
Right.
that they're telling the truth.
So powerful.
Yeah.
Which is why I think this next part of the book is so important.
Okay.
Gladwell tackles this myth that we can read people,
Oh, yeah.
like figure out their intentions just based on their facial expressions
Right.
or body language.
Like, we're all human lie detectors.
Yeah, we all think we are.
Yeah. But Gladwell, he threw some serious shade on that idea.
He does.
He brings up Paul Ekman, this researcher who was a huge proponent of the idea that facial expressions are universal.
Okay.
Then he brings in all this research that challenges that whole concept.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Like what kind of research?
Well, like that study by Sergio Girillo and Carlos Crivelli,
Yeah.
where they found that people in different cultures actually interpret facial expressions totally differently.
Oh, wow.
Like what we in the West might consider anger, another culture might interpret as fear.
That's crazy.
I know, it just throws a wrench in that whole reading people thing,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about cultural differences either.
Yeah.
Even within our own cultures.
Yeah.
We often misinterpret what people are really feeling.
Totally. And Gladwell, he talks about this experiment where people thought they were great at faking surprise on their faces,
Really?
but they weren't nearly as convincing as they thought.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like we're not always as transparent as we think we are. And other people aren't as transparent as we assume they are.
That's where coupling comes in.
Okay.
This key concept Gladwell uses throughout the book. It's all about understanding how context shapes behavior.
Okay.
It's not always about someone's character.
Right.
It's about the situation they're in.
It's a situation.
He uses this crazy example about suicide rates in Britain.
Okay.
Apparently, when they switched from town gas to natural gas,
Yeah.
suicide rates plummeted.
What town gas had carbon monoxide in it,
Right.
which made it a very easy and sadly very effective method for suicide.
Right.
So when they switched to natural gas, that specific method was taken away.
So it wasn't that people were less depressed.
Right.
It was that the opportunity,
Holy
the
God.
coupling had changed.
Wow, that's mind-blowing.
I know.
Yeah.
And this coupling idea applies to way more than just suicide.
Oh, yeah. definitely.
Gladwell brings up crime, for example.
Okay.
He cites this criminologist, David Weisberg,
Mm-hmm.
who found that crime clusters in very specific locations. It's not just random.
Huh.
It's about the environment, the lighting, the
Yeah.
escape routes, all sorts of things.
That couple with criminal activity.
Exact.
He even did a study on prostitution in Minneapolis.
Okay.
And when they cracked down on prostitution in a specific area, a lot of the sex workers didn't just move a few blocks over.
Wow.
They actually left that line of work completely.
That's so interesting.
I know.
So their behavior was tied to that particular spot.
Yes.
To the relationship and routines they had there.
It was the context.
When you remove that context, the behavior changed.
Like a light bulb went off for me when I read that.
Yeah.
How much of what we attribute to someone's personality or character is actually just them responding to their environment?
It makes you rethink how you judge people, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It really does.
Yeah.
And that leads us to a pretty intense part of the book.
Okay.
The dangers of Kansas City policing.
Oh.
This is where things get really interesting.
All right.
The Kansas City gun experiment tried this proactive policing strategy where they aggressively searched for guns during traffic stops.
Okay.
The idea was to reduce gun violence.
Makes sense.
And it did.
But
It also created a situation where certain neighborhoods, often minority communities, were over-policed. It raised concerns about racial profiling and harassment.
because it encouraged officers to basically default to suspicion,
Right.
to see potential criminals in every interaction.
And that can have terrible consequences.
That's what we see in the case of Sandra Bland.
Okay, before we get into that,
Yeah.
I think we need to break down this whole Kansas City policing thing a little bit more.
Okay.
What exactly was this experiment,
Right.
and what were they trying to achieve?
Well, it started back in the 1990s.
Okay.
When Kansas City, Missouri was struggling with a really high rate of gun violence, like a lot of cities at that time.
Right.
They decided to try this new approach called proactive policing.
Okay.
And it was all about being more aggressive and trying to get illegal guns off the streets.
So instead of just responding to calls,
Yeah,
they were out there looking for trouble.
exactly. They focused on high crime areas
Okay.
and did things like increasing patrols,
Right.
setting up roadblocks, and, stopping a lot of people for minor traffic violations.
And the idea was that if they could find more illegal guns,
Yeah,
that would lead to less gun violence.
exactly. And you know what? In some ways, it worked.
Okay.
They did seize a lot of illegal guns, and the rate of gun violence did go down.
But there were some serious downsides, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what Gladwell really digs into.
What were they?
The biggest problem was that this kind of proactive policing
Yeah.
led to a lot of unnecessary stops and searches,
Mhm.
especially of young black men.
So it was basically racial profiling.
Well, whether it was intentional or not, that was the effect.
Okay.
And it created a lot of tension and mistrust between the police and the community.
Right. And this is where the story of Sandra Bland comes in.
Exactly. Her tragic death is a powerful example of how this mindset of suspicion, of looking for criminals everywhere,
Yeah.
can have devastating consequences.
But before we get to her story,
Okay.
I think it's important to understand what the police were actually doing during these traffic stops in Kansas City.
Yeah.
What were they looking for?
Right.
How did they decide who to stop?
They were using all sorts of pretexts to stop people.
Like what?
Things like broken taillights, expired tags, even driving too slowly.
So really minor stuff.
Exactly. And once they stopped someone, they would start asking a lot of questions.
Oh, gosh.
Looking for any excuse to search their car or pat them down.
And this is where that defaulting to truth idea gets flipped on its head.
Right.
Instead of starting from a place of trust,
Yeah.
they were starting from a place of suspicion.
Exactly. And that's what Gladwell is trying to get us to see.
Yeah.
When you approach every interaction with a stranger from a place of suspicion, you're going to see criminals everywhere, even when they're not there.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
Like racial profiling, harassment, and even violence.
Like what happened to Sandra Bland?
Okay, so let's talk about Sandra Bland.
Okay.
Can you remind everyone what happened to her?
Sure.
I know it's a tough story to hear,
Yeah.
but it's important to understand how this all connects back to what we're talking about with Gladwell.
Absolutely. In 2015, Sandra Bland was driving through Texas when she was pulled over by a state trooper, Brian Insignia,
Okay.
for failing to signal a lane change
A pretty minor traffic violation.
Right. But the interaction quickly escalated,
Cool.
and Sinya became confrontational, demanding that she put out her cigarette and get out of the car.
And that's when things really went wrong.
Yeah, Bland refused to get out of the car,
Uh-huh.
arguing that she didn't have to.
Oh, gosh.
And Insignia then threatened to use his taser on her.
Really?
The whole thing was caught on dashcam video.
And it's hard to watch.
It is.
Yeah.
Eventually, Bland was arrested and taken to jail. 3 days later, she was found dead in her cell.
Oh, my gosh.
Her death was ruled a suicide.
And her case sparked protests and outrage all over the country.
It did. It became a symbol of the systemic racism and police brutality that Black people face in America.
Right.
And what's so heartbreaking is that it all started with a routine traffic stop.
Gladwell uses this case to illustrate how this default to suspicion mindset,
Yes.
combined with the coupling of proactive policing tactics,
Yes.
can have fatal consequences.
Exactly. And Sinya approached Bland with suspicion from the start. He was looking for signs of criminal activity, even though there was no evidence of any.
Right.
And because he was looking for it, he found it.
He interpreted her behavior,
Yeah.
her frustration and anger, as resistance and defiance.
Yes.
And that led him to escalate the situation, to use force when it wasn't necessary.
Gladwell argues that if Insignia had approached Bland with more humility, with more of a willingness to see her as a person,
Right.
not a potential criminal,
Yeah.
things might have gone very differently.
And I think that's a powerful message for all of us.
Yeah.
We need to be more aware of our own biases,
Absolutely.
our own tendencies to default to suspicion.
Especially when we're dealing with people we don't know.
Yeah, it's a challenge,
It is.
but it's one that we all need to face.
Because the way we talk to strangers can have a profound impact, not just on their lives, but on our own understanding of the world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have.
We've talked about defaulting to truth, the myth of transparency,
Yeah.
and the power of coupling.
It's a lot.
And we've seen how these ideas play out in the real world,
Right.
with examples like Bernie Madoff,
Of course.
Anna Montez,
Yeah.
and Sandra Bland.
It's heavy stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
But this is just the beginning.
Oh, really?
There's so much more to explore in Gladwell's book,
Oh, good.
and I'm really excited to dive into the next part.
Me too.
So stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm still thinking about those proactive policing tactics we talked about and how that default to suspicion mindset played a role in Sandra Bland's tragic story. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And Gladwell doesn't shy away from those difficult conversations. In fact, he takes us even deeper into this world of suspicion and misjudgment as he explores the world of espionage.
Espionage, like spies and stuff.
Exactly. He focuses on Anna Montez. Remember her, the Queen of Cuba we mentioned earlier? She was that high-level analyst at the DIA who was secretly spying for Cuba for like 15 years.
Oh yeah, the one everyone trusted completely.
Yeah.
Gladwell is using her story to show how easily we can be fooled, even the experts, right?
Right. And he also uses it to critique those traditional interrogation techniques, like the Reed technique. You ever heard of that?
Vaguely, but I'm not sure I totally get it. What is the Reed technique exactly?
It's this interrogation method that's been used for decades, especially by law enforcement. It's all about reading nonverbal cues, like eye contact, posture, fidgeting, to try and figure out if someone is lying.
So like if someone is sweating or avoiding eye contact, they must be guilty.
That's the basic idea, but Gladwell argues it's way more complicated than that. He points out that these cues can mean different things for different people.
So someone could just be nervous or shy, not necessarily lying.
Exactly. Plus, Gladwell brings up all this research that shows these nonverbal cues are super subjective and can be influenced by culture, personality, all sorts of things. Trying to use a one-size-fits-all approach to lie detection is basically setting yourself up for failure.
So how does Anna Montez fit into all of this?
Well, Gladwell tells the story of how a counterintelligence officer, Scott Carmichael, started to get suspicious of Montez. But even when he confronted her directly, she didn't act like he expected a guilty person to act.
So she wasn't like sweating and stammering and avoiding eye contact.
Nope, not at all.
Yeah.
She stayed calm, even flirted with him a little. Carmichael realized later that he totally missed the signs because he was so focused on those classic tells that he thought a guilty person would show he was blinded by his own assumptions.
Wow. It makes you wonder how often we misinterpret people because we think we know what a guilty person looks like.
Right, and Gladwell is saying, hey, maybe our intuition isn't always the best guide, especially when we're dealing with strangers. Sometimes it's better to rely on facts and evidence, not just gut feelings.
Which brings us to another case. Gladwell talks about Harry Markopolos. He's the financial analyst who tried to blow the whistle on Bernie Madoff years before the whole Ponzi scheme imploded.
Markopoulos was a numbers guy, super skeptical. He spotted those red flags in Madoff's returns that no one else seemed to notice because they were blinded by Madoff's charm and reputation.
But no one believed him, right? Because Madoff was so well respected.
Exactly. They defaulted to truth, trusting Madoff, even though the evidence was staring them in the face. It took years for anyone to take Markopoulos seriously.
So it's like this double-edged sword. We need to trust people to function in society, but that same trust can be exploited.
Right, and Gladwell is saying we need to find that balance between trust and skepticism. We need to be aware of our biases and question our assumptions, especially when something seems too good to be true.
It's a tough line to walk, but it seems like being aware of this default to truth tendency is a good first step.
Absolutely. And I think that awareness is key to understanding the next part of Gladwell's book, where he gets into the really intense topic of interrogation.
Okay, this is where it gets really heavy, right? I know he talks about the interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks.
Right, the CIA used some pretty controversial techniques on him, including waterboarding. Gladwell doesn't shy away from the tough questions about whether these methods actually work and the toll they take on everyone involved.
So what's his take on all that?
Well, he dives into the psychology of interrogation, how techniques like sleep deprivation can break down someone's resistance, but he also points out that these extreme methods can lead to false confessions.
So even if someone is willing to talk, the information they give under duress might not be reliable.
Exactly. He brings in the work of Dr. Charles Morgan, a psychiatrist who studied how stress affects memory stress. Morgan found that extreme stress, like the kind you experience during a harsh interrogation, can actually mess with your ability to remember things accurately.
Wow, so even if you're trying to get the truth, using those kinds of methods might actually make it harder to find.
That's the dilemma Gladwell is highlighting. It's this tension between getting information and getting accurate information.
Yeah.
He's arguing that we need to be really careful about the methods we use because coercion might actually undermine the very truth we're seeking.
It's a complex issue, and it makes you think about the ethics of all this.
Definitely. And this is where that concept of coupling becomes relevant again. Remember the Kansas City gun experiment?
Yeah, where they were stopping people for minor traffic violations to try and find illegal guns.
Gladwell brings it up again to talk about the importance of context in policing. He argues that the experiment was successful in part because it focused on specific locations where crime was most likely to occur.
So it's not just about being suspicious of everyone. It's about understanding the specific environments where certain behaviors are more likely to happen.
Exactly. He even compares it to suicide prevention measures on the Golden Gate Bridge. Installing barriers or nets doesn't just move the problem somewhere else. It directly addresses the coupling between suicidal thoughts and a specific location.
It makes you think about how we could apply this coupling idea to other problems.
Right. Instead of this blanket approach of suspicion, maybe we need to focus on understanding the context, the circumstances that lead to certain behaviors. It's about being more nuanced and targeted.
Okay, so Gladwell is telling us to be careful about our biases, to question our assumptions, and to consider the context. But are there any practical tips he gives us? I mean, how do we actually do all this in our daily lives?
Well, that's where I think the last part of his book gets really interesting. He starts to give us some concrete advice on how to navigate this world of talking to strangers, and it all boils down to one key concept: humility.
Humility. What does that have to do with talking to strangers?
Gladwell is basically saying that we need to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. We can't know everything about another person, especially if we've just met them.
So we should stop assuming we can read their minds or accurately predict their behavior based on a few fleeting interactions.
Exactly. He's cautioning us against jumping to conclusions. Instead, he suggests we approach conversations with strangers with curiosity, openness, and a willingness to be wrong.
So more listening and less judging.
Pretty much, it's about recognizing that our first impressions can be totally off base. We should be open to changing our minds as we get to know someone better.
It's funny because that sounds like really basic advice, but I think we all forget it sometimes.
We do, especially in this world where we're bombarded with information and expected to make snap judgments all the time. Gladwell's call for humility is a refreshing reminder that it's okay to admit we don't know everything.
And it's okay to be wrong.
Right. And he brings up Sandra Bland's case again to illustrate this point. He argues that her death was, in part, a result of a collective failure to talk to strangers with caution and humility.
The officer who pulled her over, Brian Insignia, he was looking for reasons to be suspicious. He interpreted her frustration as defiance. If he had approached her with more humility, things might have gone very differently.
Gladwell is saying that our interactions with strangers, even the seemingly insignificant ones, can have huge consequences. We need to be aware of the power dynamics at play, the potential for miscommunication, and the importance of treating each other with respect even when we disagree.
I think that's a powerful message, and it makes me wonder how many conflicts, big and small, could be avoided if we all practiced a little more humility.
It's a thought-provoking question, and I think that's what makes Gladwell's book so compelling. He doesn't give us easy answers, but he gives us a framework for thinking about these interactions in a new way.
He's challenging us to be more aware, more thoughtful, and more compassionate in our interactions with the world around us.
Exactly, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's still so much more to explore in talking to strangers. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll look at how Gladwell brings all these ideas together with his fascinating example about the poet Sylvia Plath.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's take a quick break and come back for the final part of this deep dive.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into talking to strangers. We've covered a lot of ground, from defaulting to truth to interrogation tactics, and it can feel a bit heavy, but Gladwell isn't just pointing out problems.
Right.
He's trying to help us understand these things so we can do better.
I think that's what's so compelling about his work. He's not just telling us what's wrong. He's trying to help us figure out how to do better.
Exactly. And in this last part of the book, he brings it all together with this really powerful example
Okay.
that illustrates the concept of coupling in a whole new way.
Okay.
Remember, coupling is that idea that behavior is often linked to specific contexts and situations.
Right. Like, it's not always about someone's character. It's about the environment they're in.
Exactly. And he uses the story of Sylvia Plath, the poet, to really drive this point home.
Sylvia Plath. Wow. I wouldn't have expected that connection. I mean, she's known for her intense writing and her tragic suicide. How does that tie into talking to strangers?
Well, her story is often told as this straightforward narrative of mental illness and despair, but Gladwell digs deeper,
Okay.
looking at the circumstances surrounding her suicide and how those circumstances might have influenced her decision.
Okay. I'm listening.
He points out that in the years leading up to Plath's death, there was a significant increase in suicide rates in Britain, and a big part of that increase was attributed to the widespread use of town gas, which, remember, contained lethal levels of carbon monoxide.
Oh, yeah. We talked about that earlier. It's that
Yeah.
readily available method for suicide.
Exactly. It was like this tragic coupling the suicidal thoughts and this easy, accessible way to act on them.
So what changed?
Well, Britain started switching over to natural gas, which didn't have carbon monoxide, and guess what happened? Suicide rates went down dramatically.
Wow. So it wasn't that people suddenly became less depressed or suicidal. It was that the opportunity, that specific coupling had changed.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder that our environments can have a powerful influence on our actions, even in extreme situations like suicide.
It's a little unsettling to think about, but it makes sense.
And Gladwell points out that this applies to all sorts of behaviors, not just suicide. He talks about crime, alcohol consumption, even cultural norms around drinking.
I remember that example about the community in Bolivia where people regularly drank super strong alcohol, but it didn't seem to have the same negative consequences that you'd expect.
Right. Their drinking was coupled with the specific cultural context, rituals, and norms that minimize the harm. It's like those norms created a buffer, a protective layer around that behavior. It's fascinating, right?
It really is, and it makes you realize that you can't just judge someone's behavior at face value. You have to understand the context, the coupling, to really make sense of it.
That's exactly what Gladwell is getting at, and I think that's a powerful message to take away from this whole book.
So where does all this leave us? We've explored so much defaulting to truth, the myth of transparency, the power of coupling the complexities of interrogation. It's a lot to digest.
It is, but I think the key takeaway is that our interactions with strangers are full of potential pitfalls. We default to truth, but that makes us vulnerable to deception. We think we can read people, but we're often wrong, and our environments can subtly shape our behavior in ways we don't even realize.
So what are we supposed to do with all this information?
Gladwell doesn't give us a simple checklist or a set of rules. Instead, he leaves us with this challenge.
Okay.
He asks, given what we now know, how can we apply these insights to our own interactions with strangers? How can we be more mindful, more cautious, more understanding?
It's a big question, and it's one that we each have to grapple with on our own.
Absolutely. But I think that's the beauty of Gladwell's work. He doesn't give us easy answers. He makes us think. He challenges us to question our assumptions and look at the world in new ways.
And ultimately, I think he's urging us to be more humble in our interactions with others, especially those we don't know well, to recognize the limits of our understanding and approach each encounter with curiosity and respect.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Talking to strangers is a real eye-opener, and I think everyone could benefit from reading it.
Totally agree. It's one of those books that stays with you long after you finish it, and I hope this deep dive has sparked some new insights and given you some things to ponder.
We've just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore in Gladwell's work.
So keep those conversations going, but remember to tread carefully. Listen intently and approach each encounter with that healthy dose of curiosity and respect. Until next time. Happy talking.